Hi, my name is Terry Cheney, and I've been promising Dr. Wood this video for a couple of years now, so I'm a little overdue and thought today I would honor my promise. Dr. Wood helped me lose over 350 pounds between 2008 and 2012 with no drugs, no surgery. He helped get me moving again. So I want to give you a little bit of background about my life as to why I got to where I was. I was at over 700 pounds at one point. Um, in the 1964, when I was born, it was common for moms to be put out under general anesthesia, and the babies be pulled out with forceps. And I was one of those babies pulled out by forceps, pulled out a little too quickly, a little too fast. For a long time, I had a red purplish mark right here. My mom used to call it my light bulb, but that caused a major subluxation called a Currarino 1 malformation. I also was born at a time when fetal alcohol syndrome was not even a word. Nobody knew what it was. And my mother drank a couple of beers a day at the advice of her OB because she was having such heartburn and indigestion. And so I was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and nobody knew why. I was screaming and crying and throwing up all the time. And they finally, nobody figured it out, but by the time I was 4 weeks old, my mother had figured out that if she mixed Pepsi or ginger ale in warm water and put it in my baby bottles, I settled down. And by the age of 6 weeks old, my grandmother was feeding me mashed potatoes, um, real mashed potatoes made with potatoes and butter and milk and all that nice starchy, taste good stuff. So I sort of was set up before birth to fail as far as the weight was concerned. And Dr. Wood and I talked a great deal about sort of like my life was an onion and we kept peeling back the layers, and we're still working on that. Now the layers are getting tougher and harder to peel back. But we had gone through some of the life traumas that I've been through. I was told I was worthless by my father when I was 4.5 years old because my 3.5-year-old brother wound up with an axe in his head, um, playing with the neighbor boy, and I didn't even know that they were outside, but my father felt that I should have been watching my brother and wasn't. I was busy collecting leaves to make an art project. But from the time I was born, I was bounced back and forth between Reisterstown, Maryland, where we lived, and Ludlow, Massachusetts, where my grandparents lived. My mother, when I was 7 months old, my mother got her appendix exploded. I'm sorry, not her appendix, her gallbladder exploded. And she was in the hospital for over a month. And my grandmother came from Massachusetts, her mother came from Massachusetts to see what was going on and convinced my father to let her take me back to Ludlow with her. And that wasn't a bad thing. I mean, my grandmother was great. I loved her to death, and she was, my biggest cheerleader, basically. So when my brother, and then my mom was told not to get pregnant, and she got pregnant within a couple of months. My brother and I are only 18 and a half months apart in age. So by the time she was, 2 months out of the hospital, she was expecting my brother. Um, and my grandmother brought me back here to Reisterstown when my brother was born. So I'd spent the whole time of my mother's pregnancy in Massachusetts with my grandmother. Um, my grandmother came back and helped take care of my mother and the two kids for 2 weeks, and then she had to go back to Ludlow and deal with her work and things like that. Well, within a week and a half, my mother was calling her crying, "You've got to come take one of these kids. I can't handle both of them." So my grandmother took me back to Ludlow. And so began what I'd call the Great Bounce. I'd be a couple weeks in Ludlow, and then my parents would want me back, and I'd only be here a week and a half. And my mother was calling crying to send, for my grandmother to come and get me. And so I got bounced back and forth. And then in November of '68, when my brother wound up with the axe in his head, then my dad called me worthless when they got home from the hospital. They left me home alone to take my brother to the hospital. And then my dad informed me that I was worthless, and I cried and was sent to my room and not talked to the whole night. And the next morning, my mother said to me, "Your grandmother's on the phone for you." And I talked to her, and she told me to pack my bags and to be brave, that she was sending a car service to get me, and that the gentleman driving the car would take me to the airport and make sure that I was in the hands of the stewardess, who would make sure I got to Ludlow okay. So at 4.5, I made my first solo flight to Massachusetts, well, actually Hartford, Connecticut, Bradley International Airport in Hartford, Connecticut. And I spent over a year with my grandparents. I was getting ready to go into the first grade, and that's when I came home, was to attend school here at home. And I was put in a Catholic school at my grandmother's request. And by the 5th grade, I had been thrown out of there because I asked too many questions. And again, that added to my feeling of worthlessness. My mother didn't drive, so my father was more interested in work and JCs and doing things with my brother. So that kind of left me out. I was always left to entertain and take care of myself. But I went through 1 through 5 here in the Catholic schools and 6 through 12 in public school. When I was in the 4th grade, I came home to find a weird yellow notice on our door with the word foreclosure on it. I was too young to understand what that meant. My mother was nowhere around. My dad, I knew, would be at work until at least midnight. So I went to the neighbors and asked if I could call my grandmother, and read the notice to my grandmother, and she explained to me what that meant, and that she would be here the next day, and that she wanted to talk to the neighbor lady. And my grandmother made arrangements with the neighbor lady for my brother and I to spend the night with her kids, who we were good friends with. And she assumed, that as I did, that my mother was on her way to my grandmother's, which was what my mom did when she got upset, was that she ran back to her mom's. And I had to, take care of my brother that night, and we got as much as we could moved into the neighbor's garage, and tarped everything else so that it didn't get ruined. And the next afternoon, when we got off the school bus, my grandmother was here with my mother and rented us an apartment. And my grandmother sat me down at that point and taught me how to balance a checkbook and write bills and pay bills and write checks and things like that. And from that point on, until I was in about the 9th grade, that's what I did for my parents. Every month was pay the bills to make sure that everything got paid and taken care of. And I had a great high school life. I was really active in, not in sports, but I was really active in the theater and student government. I did 3 plays a year from the 9th grade to the 12th grade, and had a great deal of fun doing that. But all along, I was still eating what my parents provided, which was Pop-Tarts in the morning for breakfast, and a can of Pepsi or a can of Coke or whatever. And dinners most nights were hot dogs and macaroni and cheese out of a box. By the time I graduated high school, I was 250 pounds, and I went off to college to Widener University in Delaware, and had started losing some weight. And my grandmother died in the 2nd term I was there. My grandmother and I had been very, very close, my mother's mother and I, and I was devastated by her death. And I drove from Delaware to Massachusetts the last weekend of her life, and was there with her when she died. And my mother said to me, you're losing weight, but you look weird. Your body shape is just looking weird. I don't know that I like it or not. And that really set me on a downward spiral. So I started really sort of not eating right. And then a month after my grandmother passed away, I had my gallbladder explode and had to be rushed home for surgery. And lost even more weight in the course of recovering from that, but put it all back on by the time the next semester started. And then came home after 2 years at Widener. I realized the program when I was in up there was not for me. And when I made the decision to come home, I was paying for college myself. My mother and father both called me quitters, even though I had enrolled in a college here in Maryland that had a program more liking to my desire for my life. And I did graduate from school here in Maryland in 1986 with a degree in business administration. I also, in the course of being in school here, had met a man that I adored and loved totally, and he totally loved me, and his name was Edward. And in May of 1986, we got married, and we were together 20 and a half years when he was called home from the Lord, called home. And he had a whole host of problems. He had juvenile diabetes, he had congestive heart failure, pulmonary edema, pulmonary hypertension, kidney failure, and eventually he had a full system shutdown and passed away. Um, and by that point, I had told myself that if he loved me enough, he would have taken care of himself. And really, really, when he died, felt completely worthless. My mom and my dad had died prior to him passing away, and I had taken care of both of them. And through their passing, my mom died in in 96 from multiple myeloma, and my dad died in 03 from a pulmonary embolus. So I felt pretty worthless and pretty down on myself for having both my parents gone, and I was the one taking care of them, and felt like it was my responsibility when they died, that I was responsible for their deaths, and then I was responsible for my husband's death, and spent a couple of years just being really self-destructive food-wise. I was working, and there was a grocery store next to the office we worked in, and I frequently go over to the grocery store and get a pint or two of Ben and Jerry's, and that would be dinner. I'd start my morning with a Pop-Tart and a Coke at the house, and then on my way into work, I'd stop at Burger King and get a breakfast sandwich and a 32-ounce Coke and a Hershey Sundae pie. And that was breakfast, and lunchtime I would run over to the grocery store, or go out somewhere with my boss and have a sub or a sandwich, or very rarely a salad. And then in September of 2008, I was on a business forum on Yahoo that dealt with chiropractic businesses, which is what I was doing at the time, was practice manager. And one of the gentlemen that practices out in the West Coast put some kind of comment or thread up that said, that fat people were lard asses, and broke his table that day. This person came in and exceeded the weight of the table and broke the table, and he was very upset, blah, blah, blah. And he calling fat people lard asses and not recognizing how strong the struggle is when you weigh as much as I weighed. I let him have it, and I blew off a lot of steam and was really, really pissed off. And within a few minutes of posting that thread, I got a private message from Dr. Joe Wood, who said, Terry, I can help you. I've helped myself, and I can help you, as long as you trust me and you listen to me. And I was at rock bottom at that point, so I trusted him, and I listened to him, and I opened my heart and my head to him a lot. And it's turned into an amazing friendship. But at the beginning, it was really tough, because I felt beaten up almost every other day when I talked to him. I now get that it was him loving me and being a stand for me that I couldn't even be for myself. But I started doing what he told me to do, and within a year, I'd lost 100 pounds. And within another year, in a couple months, I'd lost another 100 pounds. And then I lost another 100, and then 50, and I was doing really well. And then in August of 2012, I was hit by a drunk driver. He was so drunk that he blew a 2.48 at the scene and had a cocktail of narcotics in his system. He couldn't even stay awake to be interviewed. When we went to court, I saw the tape of him in the interview room, and he kept passing out, and the police had to keep trying to bring him back to the conversation, and he just was not there. 6 weeks after I had that accident, I found out I had breast cancer. I was diagnosed with stage 2 ductal carcinoma, and I felt really alone at that point in my life. I felt really like there was nobody there for me. I have a brother that's still alive, and yes, he came down to shock trauma the night of the accident, and then came down the next day to take me home, which was great and lovely. But then he left, and my sister-in-law left, and everybody left, and here I am with all these fractures, and a hand in a cast, and both feet in casts, and rib fractures that I couldn't even breathe with, and I'm by myself. And yes, I had a friend that stopped in every 3 or 4 days to check the cat litter. As you can see, my Ariel's laying behind me, and that was the only cat I had at the time. And he would stop, and he would take care of the litter, take the trash out, and he always brought me something decadent from one of the local area bakeries that had tons of chocolate in it. And he really didn't realize that that was a harm to me. He was trying to be helpful. He knows that I love chocolate decadent things. Um, and I felt worthless. And the I'm worthless conversation came flooding back in with a vengeance. And it was horrible. And I would go to cancer treatments, and there was another woman on the same schedule that I was on for the infusions. And she always had her two best friends with her, and they would make it a party. Um, they would come in wigs and crazy hats. They had uh, jello shooters or had made popsicles or all kinds of crazy things, and they were always with her. And that made me feel really lonely and really depressed and feel like I had nobody, and nobody was calling to check on me. My friends were, other than the one guy that was coming with, the chocolate stuff and then taking care of the cats, there was nobody else calling to check on me. There was nobody, even the people that considered me to be their best friends weren't there for me. They weren't calling, they weren't coming to chemo with me. I had to drive myself back and forth, which they recommend you not do, but I didn't have any choice. Um, and the accident created PTSD that I was very afraid to even get in a car. And it took me over 6 months to actually be willing to drive again. So I was using county mobility to go back and forth to these infusions, and I was doing it alone. My ribs still haven't healed completely, so it hurts to bend over, it hurts to take a deep breath. And, I had nobody. There was nobody holding my hand, nobody wrapping me in a blanket, nobody putting a scarf or a do-rag on my bald head. And I just can't explain how worthless I felt at that point. And it's taken a while for me to actually open up to Dr. Wood about that and tell him that, I gained 70 of the pounds I lost back because of feeling worthless again. Who cared? Nobody else cared about me. Why should I care? And now we're in 2017, and I lost my job, um, mostly due to my medical problems. Um, and I've started a coaching service called the Goddess of Light Coaching Ministry, so that I can help people that have been in my shoes, that have catastrophic injuries or PTSD, or feel that there's a problem in their loving relationship. I had a lot of problems in my loving relationship with my husband. I have a boyfriend that I live with now, Rick, who I communicate completely differently with because of Dr. Wood. I'm open and honest with him, and even when I'm mad and furious, I stay with the conversation and let him know why I'm mad and furious. And that works, and I'm working at losing the weight, even though moving around's a challenge. I'm still working at losing the weight. And I've lost 42 of the pounds that I had put back on. So I'm halfway almost to the 70 that I put back on to get back to where I was so I can continue losing more weight. And I'm still doing it without drugs or surgery. In fact, most of the drugs that I take these days for the pain and the other labels that the doctors have put on me cause weight to gain. So I'm really fighting an uphill battle, but I keep fighting it. And it's wonderful to have the love of a good man in my life. And it's wonderful to have Dr. Wood in my life. I don't quite know what I would do without him. And I thank God that he decided to take me on in 2008 when I was a wreck and a mess. And sad to say, I'm still sort of a wreck and a mess, Doc, but you know that, right? But that's my life. And it hurt so bad to be called worthless by my father at 4.5 because my brother wound up with an axe in his head. It wasn't my fault. I was a kid. Okay? It felt really bad to be bounced back and forth between my dad and my grandmother's house. And I'm happy I have him in my life now. Thank you, Coach T.